Welcome to all distinguished speakers of today's program and also distinguished guests and participants of today's lecture organized by Wakam Maulavi Memorial and Research Center, BMMRC, in association with the Institute for Global South Studies and Research. In fact, Professor Dr. Sabrina and Ambassador Fabian are on the international board of the Institute for Global South Studies. And I'm happy that we represent both bodies simultaneously. So this lecture series is part of continuing web programs, monthly programs we organize on important themes of our contemporary period. And today's topic is also quite significant for several reasons. And I will not venture into the topic or any sort of preliminary observations with a view to saving time, because we have to finish this today's lecture and discussion by 8:30. So I will briefly introduce our distinguished speakers today. We have with us Italian young philosopher, Dr. Sabrina Le. We are fortunate to have her with us today because we have been waiting for her lecture for some time. Um, Dr. Sabrina is presently officiating as the director of the Tawazul Center for Publishing Research and Dialogue based in Rome. As some of you must be knowing her, she is an accomplished scholar of an international repute. She is a cultural critic. She is an author of several books. And also, I'm very proud to say that she is a great translator of classics. Besides her scholarly contributions in philosophy and theology, Dr. Sabrina is a trained philosopher in that sense, Dr. Sabrina has been actively involved in interfaith dialogues, which is a highly demanding area in our times. It's as part of this broad objective that Dr. Sabrina has been translating a number of classics and works of immense value. I must say that her Italian translation of Srinarayana Guru's Atmopadesha Sadagam is one of her latest editions. And she had already done quite a number of translations, including select Upanishads, works by Raja Ram Mohan Roy, Muhammad Iqbal, and Allama Yusuf Ali's classic 1934 English translation of Quran. And over 50 classics, poems, novels, not only from South Asia, from the entire Arab world. And this also, I must say that this also included some of the translations from Malayalam, including our film actor, Malayalam film actor, Innocence, Cancer Ward Chiri. She knows that this is quite important work from the point of view of consolation, from the point of view of people who have suffered and who are suffering. And she has also translated quite a number of ancient Greek philosophical works into Italian. That's also a great thing. And as I told, Dr. Sabrina is a trained philosopher. She has specialization in ancient philosophy, but also she dealt with and also written and worked on Wittgenstein's philosophy, Karl Popper, Hannah Arendt, and several others. And she has devoted a lot of attention to build interfaith dialogues across different religions, cultures, and so on and so forth. As part of it, she travels as well as translates, and this is her important mission. We are fortunate to have her with us today, like Dr. Abdul Latif, her partner. He gave us a lecture last month, a very interesting lecture. And I must officially, formally thank you, Dr. Sabrina, for being with us, and welcome on behalf of VMMRC and also the Institute for Global South Studies. And we have today with us Ambassador Fabian, the distinguished chair of today's lecture program. All of us are familiar with Ambassador Fabian's contributions, a career diplomat with a long and accomplished career spanning over 3.5 decades, from 1964 to 2000. As he just pointed out just before this commencement of this session, he was the last ambassador of this millennium in Rome, in Italy. That's one attraction for today's lecture. Ambassador Fabian is so familiar with this place and also the country and people at large. So Ambassador Fabian, he had served in different world capitals from Italy to United States, Canada, Madagascar, Iran, Sri Lanka, and so on and so forth, and also witnessed a number of significant events in history, like, for example, the Iranian Revolution, Saddam Hussein's annexation of Kuwait. At that time, he was heading the division of the Ministry of External Affairs, having been in charge of the evacuation of more than 1.7 lakh Indian nationals, the repatriation of Indian nationals from Kuwait and Iraq when this incident happened. He had also worked with several international organizations like International Atomic Energy Agency, Food and Agriculture Organization, and so on and so forth. Ambassador Fabian also has an accomplished academic career, having worked with Symbiosis University, Indian Society of International Law. He had worked with our university in MG University as a diplomat in residence of KPS Menon Chair, and so on and so forth. And he has a number of publications to his credit, like India in the 21st Century, the Arab Spring that was and wasn't. That's a volume that is coming, brought out by Macmillan Education. So thank you on behalf of BMMRC and on behalf of the Institute for Global South Studies for your presence and also for having agreed to chair this session. And I must also welcome distinguished participants of today's session. Our patrons are here, Professor Michael Taragan, our officials, our friends, and also part of our partners, Dr. Debbie Raman, Professor Joseph Taramangalam from New York. He's actually located in Canada, currently in New York. And several others. Dr. Iqbal is expected to join. He has been a part of this journey of BMMRC right from the beginning, like Dr. Debbie Raman. We have also quite a number of friends from the media, like Ashraf Padamana and so on and so forth. I don't want to name all. We are very, very happy that this gathering is going to be an intellectually rewarding one. And with these few words, I request Ambassador Fabian to conduct the proceedings of today's session. Thank you all.
Thank you, Professor Siti, and also thank you for that very cordial introduction. What shall I say? Thank you for the flowers. Dr. Sabrina, Dr. Latif, the grandsons of the great person whose memorial we are celebrating, and Professor Tamaramangalam, Dr. Ravi Raman, Professor Michael Taragan, Mrs. Shaheen, the treasurer, and dear friends. For me, it's a great honor to be with you this evening. Let me put it this way. I wanted to ask a question to Dr. Sabrina, because I had come to Sapienza, and there is an Indology department, Torella, Dr. Torella, who has done a lot of work on Indus Valley and all that. And I think I lectured a couple of times, but it was mainly the Indology department and sometimes from the political science. They used to be there. But Sapienza is a great institution, and I was delighted to take note that you have worked with Wittgenstein also on his philosophy.
Exactly.
Now, coming to the topic, well, I think it's very relevant. The topic, religion, culture, identity, and nationalism. Now, I personally believe that the word religion has not been always used correctly. For example, take Europe. Textbooks speak of the wars of religion, 1618, 1648. And after the Peace of Westphalia, the present state system in Europe came into being, and then it spread. Now, thing is this, I don't think it was, I don't think you can explain it as a war between Roman Catholicism and Protestantism. Why? Because Catholic France, la fille aînée de l'Église, the eldest daughter of the church, whom did she support? Sweden, which was not Catholic. Why? Because Cardinal Richelieu spoke of raison d'etat. So, in our textbooks, we use the word religion not always very carefully. Now, coming to culture, it is an essential part of culture to respect other cultures. If I cannot respect other cultures, well, then I'm not cultured. However much I may talk about Indian culture, but if I cannot respect other cultures, well, it's not the same thing. Identity. Well, we can have a number of identities. Actually, Amartya Sen has, propounded much on it. But these identities need not always clash. One can be a good father, good father-in-law, good brother, good husband, and an NGO or a civil servant. But these various and belong to a particular religion. These identities need not clash. Every identity has its own, framework or constituency, But this is often forgotten. And nationalism, well, how shall I put it? I'm a patriot in the sense that I do love my country, but I do not worship my country. I worship only the Almighty. Nobody else should be worshipped, And nor do I subscribe to Hegel's theory, that the state is the absolute being, the representative of the absolute on the earth, and that the state is above morality. That's all, doesn't make much sense. Now, Wakam Maulavi, he wrote once in Swadeshabhimani, fear, crookedness, and greed will not build a country. I repeat, fear, crookedness, and greed will not build a country. Those words are relevant, for all time. This was written, I believe, under the masthead of the paper. And today I read in the Telegraph an excellent article on him by Sabine Iqbal, his grandson, who is in Bangalore, I believe. But I'm also in Bangalore, but we are not in touch physically. So, ladies and gentlemen, we are all eager to hear Professor Dr. Sabrina. So, on your behalf, let me request her to address us.
So thank you very much, Respected Ambassador Fabian, Professor Siti, Engineer Samir, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honor for me to be with you this evening to have a conversation about the topic that has already been said. It would be religion, culture, identity, and nationalism. A brief philosophical investigations and reflections. I really thank Malcolm Molovi Research Center for this invitation, that the great honor and also the opportunity for me to share with you some of the ideas that are currently on the way and to be further developed, because actually I'm in the process of writing a book about the issues on which I'm going to speak with you today. So the notion of a religion, culture, identity, and nationalism is a quite deep, wide, and to a certain extent controversial topic to consider. The debate related to the notions and concept of religion, culture, identity, nationalism, could be interpreted each in its own sphere. So this means one separate from the other, or as interrelated, represent actually the main topic discussed under different point of view in the philosophical philosophy, not only in the 20th and 21st centuries, but even before, when the debate related to the relation between different notions reaches its peak and became extremely complex. So actually, even when this notion, this concept has been always at the center of what is usually called political philosophy, or that part of philosophy which deal about human relation in a political context, this notion became the center of some very deep philosophical reflection only in the last 2 centuries. This for several reasons. In our time, actually, in the 20th century, nature of the relation between this concept became quite critical, and Western thinkers, and just among the others, we just quoted Karl Popper and Hannah Arendt, rediscussing all these notions, putting them under scrutiny and analysis in the history of philosophy itself and Western metaphysics as a whole. Actually, before the disaster and the crisis of the 2 world wars, the imperialism, the rise of totalitarianism, and embodied both in Nazism and the Stalinism, which are all responsible actually of the systematic persecutions and the death of millions of people, are interpreted by these thinkers not as events detached from the history of Western thoughts, but in some cases as the most horrendous outcome of some of his premises and assumptions. So this means that political philosophy became itself a problem. So it's not considered anymore as part of a wide philosophical discourse, but it was seen as, in a way, the responsible of some very disastrous political outcomes of the Western world and Western society. And this is very interesting because even when on this occasion, actually, we don't have the possibility to proceed further in the analysis how Western philosophy, Platonism, and also, as before has been recalled by the Ambassador Fabian, also Hegelianism mainly, seems to have deeply influenced the idea of the modern nation and its historical antecedents. However, it's very important to underline that the Western model of nation, especially in is an early concept and manifestation in the 19th and 20th centuries, has been adopted quite uncritically in other parts of the world. So this means that other parts of the world, so no Western world, who have got a different historical developments, who has got a different cultural environment, who's got very different history, actually tend to approach the problem, the notion of state, the notion of nation, according to this Western model. And this is very interesting, the fact that this happening also in the countries which have been for several centuries under the Western imperialism. So I will actually try to read the three notions of identity, religion, and culture in relation to the concept of national state, nationalism, and its radical forms. So this is the key of the lecture. So all these three notions of identity, religion, and culture will be read in relation with the concept of the national state. The identity of a nation, as well as that of an individual, is never monolithic or static. And this is what I thoroughly believe. But is actually an outcome of an historical process of exchange, compromise, and growth. The systematic negation of a change and historical development is a feature actually of classic metaphysical Greek thought. This is the reason why that before I spoke about Platonism, which interpreted actually sameness and identity as the real. So what is cannot be under historical development, what is the eternal, what is out of historical environment is actually real. Change and otherness are not only unreal, so the lack of reality in the metaphysical sense, but they are also negative notions and symptoms of decadence. For the classic Greek mentality, every change in the status quo, so every change it was considered towards the decadence. There was not actually a thought, metaphysical thought was towards a betterment or simply recognize the reality of change in its metaphysical value. The word identity actually comes from the Latin noun identitas and idem, which means actually the same, namely something which is not subject to change or is not prone to change. In our time, this word, this term and notion of identity is widely used in connection with the notion of identity politics. Among the other use of the word, where a lot of you will be quite they will know the use that in our time has been done on different from different side of this notion of identity politics, which is I think is a concept extremely dangerous from the political point of view, in which some contemporary thinkers both in the West and the East uses in extremely uncritical and quite naive way. Maybe some cases without being completely aware of its dangers and pitfalls of the notions of identity politics in the public arena or in the political environment of a given state or a group. Briefly speaking, the notion of identity politics is at the same time a product and a reaction to the notion of radical nationalism. It is a product of radical nationalism in the case of an ideology promoted by a group of people, a cultural movement, or a political party, which assumes its supremacy on others on the foundation of a strong identitarian politics. Instead, the same identity politics, from another perspective, could be interpreted as a reaction from the same minorities victimized by strong identitarian politics. So the identitarian politics actually is a double-edged weapon. In order to understand how this could be possible, I would like to introduce here the notion of violent dialogical relation, a concept on which I'm currently working. In the course of this lecture, I will try to introduce this notion quite briefly, because I think it's very relevant to the point that we are here discussing. Self-identity is built actually on relation to the other from the self. This dialogical relation can assume a twofold character. The self could be built the symbolical image of the other in a relation of position, respect to an idealized image of the self. This means that the self builds its own image, which is idealized in opposition to the other, to what is different from himself. Or the self could build this identity or narrate its history independently from the other, even if it recognizes existence by establishing a dialogical relation. In the second case, the connection could be interpreted free from conflict and is rooted actually on equality and open to a possible collaboration. So in the first case, and this is the one we are trying to explain today, the relationship between the identity, the self-identity, and the other, between me and someone who is opposing me, is necessarily conflictual. In sight, it is unidirectional and lack of reciprocity. This is why this is a violence. And the first stage, when the self engages with the other in a relation not only potentially, but truly conflictual, which aims at the defeat and submission of the supposed enemy, the other starts to elaborate and develop a self-description and self-narration in the function of the hegemonic and violent self, losing its symbolic independence. So this means that the other became dependent to the self, to the strong identitarian subject, is capable not only to read himself in opposition to the other, but is also capable to inflict on the other in the way in which the other looks at himself. So the other is actually loses independence. A consequence of this dynamic emerges a relation devoid of balance and reciprocity, which is grounded in turn on hegemonic identity discourse, which could be actually described and called as a violent dialogical relation. Briefly speaking, in the violent dialogical relation, the other is never independent. I mean, before losing its independence socially and politically, it loses its independence psychologically. This is at the beginning of the process. And it loses, as we said, independence in the construction of its own identity and historical development, in the interpretation of the past, organization of the present, and planification, the planning of the future. And it assumed a very much reactive attitude. In other words, the other became incapable of a free and independent expression of his individuality and assumes a reactive behavior. To this reactive behavior, the violent dialogical relation is actually both sustained, supported, and continued. The other, during this historical dialogical process, assimilated unconsciously and passively the discourse which objectified him. Throughout the objectifying discourse of the violent self, the other loses the status of the independent subject and consequently is excluded from an autonomous historical development. The other actually could be described as an individual, as a community, a nation, or civilization. This is a process that could be applied from a singular to a community of people, but the process more or less will be the same. So the other, which is actually fell in the trap, in the pitfall of being engaged in passively in a violent logical relation, get out from an independent historical process, and its history, both present and future, becomes functional to the violent self. And in the cases of the past one, is rewritten according to the interpretative parameters of the violent self. In a violent dialogical relation, which lacks of equilibrium and reciprocity, the self assumes the character of the absolute independence, becoming the only driving force of world history, while the other assumes the character of dependence, and the only suitable available role for him is the passive assimilation and annihilation of individuality and historical, cultural, religion, political diversity. This means an hegemonic culture who is rooted in a strong identitarian politics has got a tendency to try to assimilate when it's possible. When it's not even possible to assimilate, it starts to the process of annihilation. So complete destruction of the otherness. The identity of the dependent other is built in function of the violent self and consequently is qualified always as other and never as independent and autonomous self. In the violent geological relation, that is denied to the other the possibility itself of self-narration and self-expression. This means that the other is always in conflictual relation with the autonomous self, and he cannot get out of this trap in which the violent relation put it before in a psychological sense, and then later socially, and then at the end of the stage also politically. In the extreme form of identity politics, the notion of different and otherness is quite problematic. Since it is interpreted mainly and most of the time exclusively as something negative in the dialectical sense, and to be integrated, assimilated, or annihilated into the identity. In the same form of identity politics, others are by definition enemies. It is not contemplated the possibility of their being in dialogue. According to the identity politics, the notion of identity and difference are interpreted in a relation of necessary opposition instead of complementarity. In the context of our discourse, the notion of different could be meant in a religious, cultural, and ethical sense. So there is no a practical, is a quite general concept that could be applied not only is in relation to religion, to culture, or to a national way, or an ethical sense. Between identity and difference, or between sameness and otherness, the relation is always violent, rooted in violence. The relation could be named as violent when actually the identity is identified with something universal, historical, so out of historical development, and a foundational. Instead, the difference or otherness should be read as its opposite, particular, historical, so actually considered as an accident in the historical development, and contingent. So, according to the paradigm of historical evolution, which we could define as violent, the particular and the different should be reduced to the unity of the identity by necessity. According to this identitarian model, the history of a civilization or a nation reaches its peak of its maximum level of development when what is particular or contingent, could be a minority group or or a class also. This is not necessary. It could be applied in different categories. Began just to be something to be assimilated. So there is a time which the process of assimilation stops and becomes a threat to the stability of a given nation or civilization. This attitude, which is by itself a clear symptom of weakness and degeneration, is necessary outcome, the rejection of dialogue, the absence of any exchange, and the resistance toward the historical becoming and development. History, consequentially, is reinterpreted, rewritten, and reread according to this paradigm, which actually leads from both a social and political point of view to a clash, which seems to be inevitable. Past, present and future became spread of an ideology, which could be rooted in racism, religious bigotry, imperialism, or may have other foundations or assume other forms as well. An ideology, in this context, it is always a political weapon, both at the beginning and the end of the process. An ideology could be actually defined as a way of interpreting historical development according to some strictly defined laws, which are considered as eternal and necessary. An ideology, by definition, see in the historical application of the foundational premises the fulfillment of the real essence of history. Briefly speaking, identity politics, ideology, and radical nationalism are all expression of a violent ideological relation. So even if we consider identity politics, theology, and radical nationalism together as a whole, or actually at different stages as separate phenomena, there we can analyze them as all expression of this violent ideological relation. An ideology actually demands to this adherents the complete submission of their human consciousness, and in exchange it gives a false reassurance of lack of responsibility. The blind obedience to the intellectual premises and the political practice of the ideology, when it assumes also a political dimension endowed with power, it is extremely dangerous for the stability of a nation, and actually, and mainly the respect of human rights. Briefly speaking, when a political organization chooses to be the practical expression of an ideology, then its main scope is to destroy the existing status quo in order to rebuild it, according to the ideological premises of the ideology. And this is actually what Nazi, for example, was doing in Germany, and then a model that he tried to export through his wars of aggression in all Europe. If we interpret radical nationalism, ideology, and identity politics as different features and expression of the same attitude, it became clear as these three notions destroy the space of public and personal interaction between individuals in a given society. Actually, even when this mass movement can give what they do is to depersonalize and deresponsibilize, because an ideology actually they promote both depersonalization and deresponsibilization. It's a clear expression of mass society and atomized society, are really devoid of the basic concept, the notion of human solidarity and collaboration. In a totalitarian society, which represents the triumph of an extreme form of identity politics, the individuality of every human being is totally disregarded and sacrificed on the altar of anonymity, mass of people ready to follow blindly the leader, which is the personal embodiment of the ideology. So actually a class of intellectual in this kind of is or subservient to the power, or they are totally deleted from the public space. In the origin of totalitarianism, Hannah Arendt wrote, totalitarianism strives not towards despotic rule over men, and then I could see not only, but towards a system in which men are superfluous. Total power can be achieved and survived only in a world of conditional reflexes of marionettes without the slightest trace of spontaneity. Precisely because man's resources are so great, he can be fully dominated only when he becomes a specimen of the animal species man. Therefore, character is a threat, and even the most unjust legal rules are an obstacle. But individuality, anything that can distinguish one from another, is intolerable. Instead, a true political practice should be related to an ethical choice, which is at the same time a choice of freedom and a choice of responsibility. But an ethical choice, before being a collective choice, of course, an ethical choice can have always, then even not always the truth, but always in a way should have a reflection in the society or in the environment which is made. Before being a collective choice or a communal choice is and should be, first of all, an individual choice, an act of personal responsibility. The presence of freedom along with responsibility is what differentiates what Karl Popper has defined as a closed and open society, respectively. The Austrian thinker defined the closed society as follows. A closed society resembles a herd or a tribe in being a semi-organic unit whose members are held together by same biological ties, kinship, living together, sharing common efforts, common danger, common joys, and common distress. It is still a concrete group of individuals related to one another, not made by such abstract social relationships and division of labor and exchange of commodities, but by concrete physical relationships, such as touch, smell, and sight. So it's a primitive society, actually. In the closed society, which are at the beginning of human civilization was the original structure of the primitive human settlement and culture, there is only one interpretation of reality, which is actually shared by all the members of a group or community. This typical golden age actually is disrupted by the evolution and improvement of human civilization, which include the confrontation with more refined and complex environment. Sorry. Briefly speaking, the closed society could be considered the norm at the particular stage of human history, a very primitive one. Now, so, for example, Popper has introduced the notion of closed and open society when he speaks mainly about Greek, in the way the different Greek polities were organized. And then he made a difference between what it is Sparta was an example of closed society, primitive society. And then he said that the characteristics are protection of tribalism, shut out all foreign influence, or anti-humanitarianism. For example, shut out more especially or egalitarian, democratic, and individualist ideology, autarky, and anti-universalism and particularism. So these were the main features of closed society. On the reverse, an open society is what is, according to him, when he wants to give at the beginning of his work, as is Athens of the 1st century, at the time of Pericles. And he quoted very interesting the funeral the famous funeral oration delivered by Pericles at the time of the Wars of Peloponnesus. And then he said that our political system does not compete with institutions which are its working force. So it means they are totally original. We don't copy our neighbor, but we try to be an example. Our administration favors the many instead of the few. And this is why it's called democracy. The laws afford equal justice to all alike in their private disputes, and we don't ignore the claims of excellence. The freedom we enjoy extend to ordinary life. We are not suspicious to one another, and we don't nag our neighbor if we choose to go their own way. But this freedom doesn't make us lawless. We are taught to respect the magistrates and the law, and never to forget that we must protect people who suffer injuries or people who suffer injustice. We are also taught to observe those unwritten laws was sanction lies all in the universal feeling of what is right. Our city is thrown open to the world, and we never expel a foreigner. We are free to live exactly as we please, and yet we are always ready to face any danger. We love beauty without indulging in fancies, and although we try to improve our intellect, this doesn't make our will big. The notion of radical nationalism has been also interpreted as a tribalism. In another passage from the Open Society and its enemy, Popper said, tribalism, namely the emphasis on the supreme importance of the tribe, without which the individual is nothing at all, is an element which we shall find in many forms of historical theories. Other forms, which are not longer tribalist, may still retain an element of collectivism. They may still emphasize the significance of some group or collective, for example, a class, without which the individual is nothing at all. So in the closed society, in the primitive society, in the tribalist society, there is no place for individuality. There is no place of individual choice, and this is individual freedom, individual responsibility are always limited. In other words, the tribalistic concept of human society could be rooted in the notion of a collective entity in which every form of difference is disregarded and systematically deleted in different ways. The tribalistic society is a society where every individual loses his or her individuality due to a static concept of social dynamics and interaction. In other words, every individual in the tribalistic society knows his own place, not only knows his own place, but he could not escape from it. At the center of a tribalistic society, there is always a collective entity endowed with static features. The term tribalistic, however, should not make us think about a primordial or primitive form of society, but to a kind of society rooted in a narrow, a static concept of identity. So this means that this closed society, it could be possible even in our time. It's not a matter of a time which human development was much more backwards, but it could come back at any time. A tribalistic society, as said, it's not a matter of the past, when human ways of life and civilization actually was less complicated, more primitive, more simple. But it has been a reality, and degenerated reality, during the Western totalitarian regimes. It could also be an outcome of a series of unfortunate human choices in other parts of the world. In a passage from The Origin of Totalitarianism, Hannah Arendt clearly recognized the danger above explained with the following words. Totalitarian solution may well survive the fall of totalitarian regimes in the form of strong temptation, which will come up whenever it seems impossible to alleviate political, social, or economical misery in a manner worthy of man. So whatever there is a crisis, it could be political, cultural, economic, could be always the danger of the rise of a new way of proposing a totalitarianism. It can be assumed a religious feature, it could be a cultural feature, or any others, but in the core, the essence could be the same. The rise of radical nationalism is in most of the cases an answer to an internal crisis of a community of a nation, but this answer depersonalized and consequently deresponsibilized the individual as a person endowed with the capacity of thinking and choosing. So radical nationalism proposes one culture, one religion, one language, one race. This is everything is trapped, everything is condensed, everything is blocked in the identity of the sameness of a nation, endowed with some static features. So this means that radical nationalism is always totally against multiculturalism. Essential part of the identity of a nation, as I said before, or an individual or a collective being is constituted both by religion and culture. Even when theoretically these two notions could be studied and considered separately, in reality and in the practice of human life and civilization, they seem to be very much closely interrelated. Religion is part of a culture, at the same time culture is part molded and shaped by religion. So it's very complicated to understand the relation between religion and culture, because it's very difficult to separate them. You could try to separate them theoretically, but in the practice it's very difficult. The relation between culture and religion is very sensitive and problematic. Historically speaking, actually, culture is influenced by a given religion, but religion, if intended only as a part of the culture, risks to be misunderstood. Religion, intended as a transcendent revelation through which humanity is given a set of values and law to be followed in order to develop goodness and morality, to be considered by definition brought inside and outside historical development. As pure revelation, religion is out of history, is above history, and it is a moment of separation or crisis between the past and the future of humanity. This is the reason why at the beginning of a new course of human history, at the ancient time, there is always a religious revelation. Religion, however, is also inside human development when it became part of human life. Religion, in the first sense, is not part of a culture. So this means when we consider religion above history, it's not part of a culture, and most of the time it's against a given culture. So we can think about how Christianity was again the culture of the world, the ancient world, the pagan world, or as Islam was against actually the culture of the Arabs in the time of Jahiliyyah. So it's always kind as something which is in a way against a given culture, against some practice of a culture. But in the second sense, when it became part of human life, it is part of a culture. Unfortunately, religion is always under the risk to be assimilated by culture. This is the real problem. In order to be a source of constant positive inspiration in human life, leading humanity towards goodness and morality, it becomes another aspect of identity. It assumes a static and ahistorical feature. Briefly speaking, a religion as part of the identity of an individual, group, or civilization should be inclusive and open to historical development, or it loses in the long run the capacity to inspire a real and positive change in the society. It became bigotry, it became hypocrisy, it became an instrumentum regni. Culture and religion could be interpreted as part of the identity politics and as a means to strengthen the notion of radical nationalism. Culture and religion, in other words, could be adopted by radical nationalists as a means to strengthen, spread, and sustain the notion of identity previously explained. As far as the meaning of the term is concerned, multiculturalism indicates the presence of two or more cultures inside a space, but the space could be national, geographic, political, and social. Multiculturalism at the national and geographical levels indicate the presence of different cultures inside a space geographically circumscribed, which could be or not also politically organized. Instead, about the political and social levels, multiculturalism is related to the impact of different cultures on the political and social sphere. All this distinction, however, could be reconducted to a central issue widely discussed in our time. How is possible, and if it is possible, that a multi-religious or a multicultural society could reach the political unity? So here the problem, this is also a problem that is widely discussed in the West, in Europe now, and also in North America. How is possible that a society which is multi-religious and multicultural reach a political unity? So a kind of collaboration towards the good of a nation. The main question is, multiculturalism is a threat to the identity of the nation? When the right-wing parties in Europe, they always use these cards. They play these cards at the time of election when don't have anything to say. They always stress the fact, no, multiculturalism is a threat to the identity of a nation. But this question raises over two fundamental issues. The notion of identity is monolithic. The historical identity interpreted as a process, it is possible. The answer to these two questions is negative, actually, according to the premise that we explained before. And it involves the notion of identity and difference, interpreted not as an oppositional relation, but as complementary. So, in other words, identity is meaningful only in relation to difference, and difference could be understood only in relation with identity. They cannot stand separate from each other, neither semantically and neither philosophically. This means that in their semantic and dialogical relation, these two terms could not be separated. The relations stand on a series of paradigms which are not to be reduced to a rational speculation, but they are the outcome of a political and ethical choice. The grammar of a language is first of all ethic. It is an ethic act. It is a moral act before being political. I know that actually I'm just completing. I will try to. We said I know that a lot of questions and issues will be raised during this lecture, but I will try to complete giving a brief summarization. The notion of identity politics, radical nationalism, and ideology could be considered and interpreted as different features and expression of what has been defined as violent theological relation. In the violent theological relation, the identity of the sameness denies the otherness and the difference the right to exist. And throughout ideology and political and cultural propaganda starts a direct or indirect process of an attempted assimilation, which in the end is also evolving an attempt to open annihilation. In a political scenario of this kind, every recourse to history, religion, or culture of the prominent identitarian group is always symbolical and highly mythical. So, namely, does not tend to find the truth in a process of continual research, but by an act of power and will, decides and establishes what is truth and what is not, what is right and what is not. The supposed universalism of the violent theological relation destroys in the long run the human individuality, making, as has been clearly explained by Hannah Arendt, every human being superfluous and replaceable. The politics rooted in radical nationalism and ideology destroys the public arena. Virtually, we should be sharing ideological process by all the individual parties. And group involved. The main differences between a closed and an open society rest on the value attributed to the freedom, dignity, and responsibility of each human being. In an open society, every political act and choice is, first of all, an act of freedom and responsibility. So thank you very much for the attention. I hope it has been clear. Thank you very much. Sorry for being too late. Thank you. Thank you again.
Thank you, Dr. Sabrina, for that insightful presentation of a theme of enduring importance and of special importance now, because we see that there is a global decline of democracy, and you sort of took us to Hannah Arendt and all the way to Pericles. So you're given us what we may call a philosophico-historical account. You also mentioned that the rest of the world uncritically accepted the Western, political philosophy and all that. Yes, that is true. In fact, decolonization, to my mind, has 3 stages. First stage is political decolonization, when formal independence is gained. The second is economic decolonization, which takes more time and perhaps may never be attained. And the third, the most important, is intellectual decolonization, decolonization of the mind. That is rather tricky, and often we note that when the struggle for independence takes place, there is a better decolonization of the mind than after the political independence is gained. That is, the political elite, which has the political power, is no longer interested in intellectual decolonization. So we live in an age where, on the face of it, the Western colonialism is at an end, but the intellectual and economic domination continues. Now, I'm sure, your presentation has is going to, what shall I say, trigger a very interactive session, because that is the most important part of any get together. So may I request Professor Siti to identify the speakers and, control that, because sitting from where I am, I might be finding it difficult electronically.
And we can have a few questions at the beginning, either directly, or if they can type out their questions in the chat box, we can read it out. Either way, we can do it. I think Ravi Raman has a question. Ravi, please unmute.
Oh, sorry. I've been saying something. Yeah, sorry about that. So, Sabrina, I really like the presentation. I mean, it's really interesting, very enlightening presentation. And as Ambassador Fabian has rightly pointed out, this is a very important theme to be discussed, particularly when we find that there is some sort of what is called a diminution in terms of global democracy. So that way it is very interesting. I mean, in the last part of your presentation, you were giving emphasis on what is called the conflict between religion and culture, and also the notion of the democracy and identity and that sort of things. Then I was just thinking about what exactly has been happening with respect to the Western academia, the Western intellectuals, in addressing the question of what is called some of these notions. Say, for instance, the notion of secularization, for instance. I mean, if at all we really wanted to address this conflict between religion, nation, identity, and culture, basically we go for a very umbrella sort of a notion of secularization, So what exactly has been happening with respect to the writings of most of these intellectuals from the West? Say, for instance, if you look at the writings of Richard Falk, of course, Ambassador Fabian might be able to say more about that. If you locate the recent writings of Richard Falk, you would find that some sort of a decline or diminution of what is called the social significance attached to secularization thesis. There is a moderation over the years. If you look at the writings of other sociologists, again you would find that some sort of a moderation taking place in their approach. If you look at even the writings of Habermas, even when writing about the post-secular society sort of things, one one would be able to locate the kind of what is called the moderation in his approach, or in the tone, or in its what is called in its texture. So why this has been happening, and is it still happening, and why this could be happening with respect to the Western intellectual thought?
So I think this is, can I answer now or wait for another? No, can I answer now?
Dr. Sabrina, we can have your responses after taking a few questions.
Okay.
So that we will save time.
Yeah, perfect. Yes.
I have a comment. I do not know whether it is a question. As a continuation of what Dr. Devi has mentioned about the way we approach secular options today. No, there was a time when we had heard about the promises of modernity, the claims of modernity, that as you progress, you will tend to get across all kinds of identities, rigidities, parochialism, and all sorts of things, moving towards a secular society. That was the promise of Western modernity. I must say that, and that has been spread across this world through colonial modernity. But what happened was that in the process, the very process of modernization, or whatever you call it as modernity, we have come across multiple identities getting proliferated across the world. We have in India, like for example, within this colonial modernity project, we have a counter nation building process started in the form of a counter nationalism. At least we had 3 competing nationalisms during the British period, like the Muslim nationalism, the Hindu nationalism, and the so-called the international, so-called the nationalism put across by the INC, International Congress, and like that. We had similar experiences across this world, wherein wherever you have modernity getting addressed, these issues of the social living in different forms, we have this crisis being felt across this world in different forms. So do you think that this modernity project, if you call it as a project itself, was riddled with a lot of problems, in the sense that, you know, modernity itself created a room for multiple identities in different forms, with capital accumulation taking place across the world on a global scale, giving room for new locations of inequality, unequal power relations, social dislocations, wherein again people began to catch up with identities as the solution for all these things like that. So in that sense, don't you think that the modernity itself was a kind of a problematic project with its hidden agenda of a kind of maybe economic development, prosperity project, hiding all contradictions, but it was not possible to hide everything over a period of time, but got expressed in different forms, and we are now grappling with these identities in different ways. So this problematic, how do you look at this problem? I think we don't talk much about secularism, and we don't talk much about pluralism and things like that. We have heard about more and more about these identities in the midst of what we call the promises of modernity, now in the form of a globalization project. We can have a few more questions, then we can answer.
May I ask one question?
Yes, sir, please.
Dr. Sabrina, I wanted to ask you, one has been following the debate about what's happening in Ukraine, and there is a fear that there might be a war, and the American president has been saying if I remember right, since the 19th of January, that, the war, President Putin might invade Ukraine at any time. Now I think they have given a date, another 2 days more or 3 days more. But what I found is that there was an absence of understanding of history in discussing the matter. That is, the 2014 annexation of the Crimea was seen purely as aggression on the part of Putin. Yes, I agree it was aggression, but at the same time, we also have to remember that in 1783, the Russian Navy went to the Crimea, Sebastopol, because they wanted warm water port. So for Russia, it was a question of major national security importance. Now that aspect I have not seen covered by most of the Western commentators. Now tell me, why this allergy to look at things in some historical depth? Why is there?
I think you can respond. In meantime, others can think about it. Okay.
Yes, so actually the three questions are all related to each other. So there are different ways to see, I think, the same phenomenon. Of course, that in the West, the problem now that most of the there is a difference between what politics says. So what is politicians actually they are spreading, which message they are spreading, and where actual intellectuals are going. So the notion of secularism has been very much rampant in all the Western discourse, intellectual discourse. So when I personally, when I attend Sapienza, that was it's impossible even to study a religious thinker. All the Christian thinkers of the past, but even also of the modern time, they were actually deleted from the picture. The main studies were related to the fathers of the founders of philosophical thought, or in the end there were great things like Kant or Hegel, or all the great school were coming from Germany. So there was actually an attempt to create an intelligentsia, to create some thinkers who were rooted deeply in secularism. But it's a kind of secularism that was in itself a kind of religion. When I say kind of religion, this means that the secularism was acritical. But the time was easy. Because we could say that the traumatic experience that Western history has got with the wars of religion, the attempt to control the human consciousness through spiritual power by the Catholic Church, and the different conflicts who came after the attempt of after the Lutheran reform to create a national state and also freedom of consciousness in individuals in relation to political universalism promoted by the Catholic Church, and actually from the spiritual point of view, the control and enslavement of individual consciousness to the power, the spiritual power of the church was given. This is actually create an outcome of a kind of liberation, an outcome of a kind of refusal of all the issues brought by this the historical development of these concepts. And later also the anti-Semitism and the disaster of Nazism, mainly. This is in the Western world, but of course in the communist bloc, the relation with the religion was much more complicated, because there was a very strong attempt of annihilation, complete annihilation of religious discourse. But also in the West, this rampant secularism was something that was at least widely shared by all the Western people. So it became part of the identity of Western people, this complete clear separation between religion or religious affiliation and the political, the social spheres, in which no religious discourse or no discourse which was rooted or justified by religious principle was accepted by definition. Then now we are in a post-secularist society, I think, due to the presence of multiculturalism. The fact that we have got, and Italy in this regard has been the last one, but in the other part of Europe, we've got different groups, different communities who are coming from a background which religion has got a deep weight, got a deep significance, individual, collectively and individually. So the importance of religion there, it came out in all its strength. So these groups and who became actually integral part of our European society, they actually promote a new relation with the religion, who from their part is quite natural, but from the part of the Western counterpart, this is why this problem, it starts the problem between the ratio between the identity and otherness is quite clear when a strong secularist society, because most of the time also deeply religious think they promote a very strong secularist point of view on political and social issues. So this is very interesting. But later, because especially that the Habermas actually he was in a way follower of Popper, because he speak about this ideological space, this ideal community in which all the participants they got the same rights to participate in the decision making, or in the public space, or in the exchange of opinions, or so in order to participate together and create a political unity. This is what I was saying before. Can a multiculturalist society, multireligious society create a political unity? These things, they are trying to promote a vision in which this multicultural society, multi-religious society, in which from a way give put to in a way molded and or limited the influence of the rampant secularism of the time when I was in my 20s. Actually, this is a way due to the attempt to create a political unity or a discourse which will bring us this European society towards a political unity, which is not denying the differences, but to be in constant dialogue, which cannot be never said completed. This is what is an open society. An open society in which always there is no the word hand is banned. So there are only stages. There is all stages. There are all ways of contamination, and there are ways of creating, in a way, in the political decision, the political arena, also space of autonomy, but also space of which there is a way to find the best solution to issues, or also to contaminate each other, to create also other ways of social organization, which or social interaction will not been before. So this is the mean. This is the reason why I think that this is what the sociologists or also philosophers, they are trying to promote. So they are trying to promote a new way to see the political arena or the social interaction arena, not as I said before, in which identity and difference, they are trying to find not a synthesis, because the synthesis is something different, and in Hegelian sense is something which comes from thesis and antithesis, but then it's something static. But what we are trying to create is to maintaining differences, is to create or to give to be difference as the engine or something which put into motion a new way of seeing society, a new way of building a peaceful coexistence between groups, and a way of collaborating, which is also a way of respecting, a way of knowing, but also a way of changing. So if there is something which is wrong in a community, something which should be changed, this is from both of the sides. This could be done in this in the process of not only self-assertion, but also reciprocal knowledge. And yeah, then there is the problem of modernity, and yes, the problem that modernity and secularism. Yes, it's the problem. Modernity, or it could be a political project. It's not globalization or modernization of the. Is another name, I think, of imperialism. So before we speak about this intellectual decolonization, I think we are still in the process. But when people were so until 10-15 years ago, there was a very triumphant way of speaking about globalization. But I think the issue of globalization has been only and mainly a political agenda pushed by some very strong economical power, and has been actually an economical project. An economical project which is not most of the time has got a very nice feature, because most of the time they work on different covers, which is not because it could be an attempt to control the sources or of a country through some political tools. So to a kind of create a distraction, a kind of create a political discourse in which there is more this proliferation of identities, and not only proliferation of identities, but the strong assertion of identities, which is actually most of the time violent, which is most of the time in constant and necessary opposition to the others, disrupts in a long way a society, disrupt the democratic tissue of a country, the texture of a country. So there is, and this will also create a way to replace. So it will be a void of power, because a political power is could be also a phantom of a real political power, could be also a way of covering something which is happening behind, so behind the door. and while on the stage there is a drama going on, but who knows what is happening behind the stage. This is what makes me think about this way of imposing as paternalistic, as I don't know, some people in other parts of the world, some nations or groups, they cannot in a way. They're still under a kind of minority age, so they are still children to be led. So it's a kind of a way of saying, oh, okay, that they are kind of incapable. The modernity among among some groups or some culture doesn't work, but modernity or our way of thinking modernity, so towards the rampant secularism, which is a way of denying in a way the space or the self-expression of the people in some areas, which is different to religious bigotry. It became in a way the same. So they create actually destruction in the society because there is an imbalance. And this could be also in a way an imperialistic project. I think that now there is a yes, because the ambassador Fabian said why especially in the media, there is a lack of historical perspective. Actually, the media, they not only have the historical perspective, they don't have the perspective of what they said yesterday, because there is always, every day, they are feed with something. So every day, there is something that...
Dr. Sabrina, I just want to remind you of your next program, which is...
yes.
Yeah.
Just finished right now. So
sorry to interrupt you.
No.
Dr. Sabrina is supposed to attend another session by 8:45. So we are compelled to wind up this session. I would request Ambassador Fabian to continue with this final words about this session.
Thank you, Dr. Siti. Then, well, we are assembled to remember, honor, and celebrate the life of a great man who had the courage to speak truth to power. You know, his newspaper was shut down. Now, one wonders what he would have said about Kapan, the journalist who is, I don't know where he is now. Is he in UP and in jail? Or what he would have said about what happened to Father Stan Sami. The thing is this, the values and principles for which Wakam Maulavi stood, they are valid today. And let me make it very clear, they are under some attack. So they need to be defended, and it is our task to defend them. Well, from Dr. Sabrina, we had a very in-depth account of what is happening to us. You know, when she spoke about religion, culture, identity, and all that, she was actually showing a mirror to us. You know, we got a chance to look at ourselves, and she also told us what we should do. So let me thank VMRC and the International Center for Global Studies, South Studies, for what you have done. Congratulations and a big thank you.
We have the final words from our BMMRC official, Mrs. Shaheen. I would request her to officially, formally thank the participants, especially the distinguished speakers. Shaheen.
Thank you. Respected Chair, Ambassador KP Fabian, the speaker of today's special lecture, Dr. Sabrina, late Director, Tribalism Center for Research and Dialogue, Rome, Italy, and other distinguished guests and esteemed participants of this program. We have listened to an excellent lecture today on an important topic of great relevance: religion, culture, identity, and nationalism. Dr. Sabrina tried to explain the theme from a philosophical perspective. She has presented it in a lucid way with a clear outlook, appropriate to the liberal ways of our social living. Being a scholar committed to interfaith dialogues and social harmony, Dr. Sabrina has delivered a message that our understanding of religion should be based on humanist values and liberal outlook. We are grateful to you, Dr. Sabrina, for an excellent lecture and fruitful interactions. On behalf of the VMMRC and the Global South Institute, I express our deep gratitude and sincere thanks to Dr. Sabrina. The chair of today's session, Ambassador KP Fabian, is a career diplomat of a great standing, and his presence and perspectives have enriched the session. On behalf of the VMMRC and the Global South Institute, I extend you, sir, our profound gratitude and sincere thanks. I also thank each and every one of today's program, our special guests and participants, especially Dr. Abdul Latif from Rome VMMRC program organizers like Shamir and Samir. Once again, I thank you all. Good night.
All the best.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Sabrina. Thank you, Latif. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Have a good night. Have a
Thank
good day
you.
for you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
The evening is still young in Rome.
Yes, of course, the first 4 o'clock. Thank you. Thank you very much.